Some people are not who they appear to be at first glance, and sometimes the truth waits for the world to notice it. I did not think much about the man sitting alone at the corner of the bar that night, and I certainly did not think that my decision to reject a simple conversation would become the moment that changed how I saw everything afterward. My name is Emily Harper. I am 27 years old, a white woman living in New York City, where nights are loud, lights are bright, and strangers are everywhere, each one blending into the background noise of the city unless something forces you to look twice. That evening began like many others, with me meeting a friend after work at a small bar in Manhattan, the kind of place where the lighting is low, the music is steady, and conversations are carried out in half-whispers over the sound of glasses being placed on wood. I remember choosing a seat near the center, close enough to feel part of the room but far enough to observe it, a habit I had developed over the years without even realizing it. That was when I noticed him. He was sitting alone near the far end of the bar, a white man in his mid-30s, wearing a simple dark jacket and a neutral expression that made him blend into the environment rather than stand out from it. There was nothing immediately remarkable about him, no loud gestures, no attempt to draw attention, just a quiet presence that seemed content to exist without being noticed. When he eventually turned slightly toward me, it was only to acknowledge my presence with a brief, polite attempt at conversation. I do not remember his exact words, only that they were calm and unassuming, the kind of words that do not demand a response. I remember how I declined. Not rudely, but firmly, the way you decline a conversation you are not looking for, and then I turned back to my drink, thinking nothing more of it. He did not react the way most people would. There was no visible frustration, no attempt to insist, no change in expression that suggested he had been affected by the rejection. Instead, he simply nodded once, as if accepting a fact that required no further attention, and turned slightly away, returning to his silence. I thought that was the end of it. I thought he was just another stranger passing through the same space for a few minutes of his life before disappearing into the city like everyone else. But something about the stillness of his presence stayed with me longer than I expected, not enough to disturb me, but enough to be remembered. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating repeatedly on the nightstand, and when I finally reached for it, I saw message after message from friends, coworkers, and even people I had not spoken to in months, all asking me the same question in different forms. Have you seen the news? I sat up slowly, still half awake, and turned on the television in my apartment, the screen flickering to life with breaking news coverage, reporters standing in front of a building downtown, their voices urgent but controlled. And then I saw his face. The same man from the bar. The quiet stranger I had rejected without a second thought. Except now he was not just a man in a bar. His image filled every channel, every headline, every screen repeating his name with a level of attention that did not belong to someone ordinary. I froze, unable to process how the same person who had sat quietly beside me hours earlier could now be at the center of something that the entire city was watching. I did not yet understand what it meant, only that the world had clearly seen something about him that I had not, and that my decision to dismiss him so casually had suddenly become a memory that felt far heavier than it should have been. The morning after the bar encounter was quiet, but the city seemed to hum differently around Emily Harper, a white woman of 27, as she walked through her apartment, sunlight spilling through sheer curtains and catching the soft highlights of her hair, illuminating her calm yet slightly tense expression. Her phone buzzed repeatedly on the kitchen counter, each message a reminder of the extraordinary events she could not yet comprehend. She picked it up, scrolling through texts from friends and colleagues, all pointing to the same fact: Lucas Sterling, the quiet stranger from last night, was now the center of every news broadcast, his face appearing on every channel and online feed with an intensity that made her stomach tighten with curiosity and unease. She set down the phone and moved to her living room window, looking out over the streets of Manhattan, the urban landscape seeming both familiar and strangely altered, as though she were seeing the world through a lens of new awareness. Coffee in hand, she reflected on her brief interaction with Lucas, the politeness of his words, the calm neutrality of his response to her rejection, and how little she had understood the weight of his presence. Every detail of his posture, the way he had observed without insistence, and the understated composure in his eyes now felt significant in a way it had not before, signaling depth, influence, and hidden intent. Her mind raced through possibilities. Who was he? How had he become such a figure that his appearance commanded citywide attention overnight, and why had she encountered him first in such an ordinary, intimate setting? She paced the small apartment, glancing at the television screens, the news anchors discussing events tied to Lucas with cautious authority, while her heart beat faster at the realization that the man she had dismissed so casually was no longer just a stranger. He was a person with influence and a story that intersected with hers in an unforeseen and deeply compelling way. The city outside moved in its normal rhythm, unaware of the silent tension that had now settled in her apartment, the contrast between everyday life and the extraordinary revelation making every sound and movement seem amplified. Emily tried to compose herself, taking slow breaths, feeling both curiosity and a subtle wariness, acknowledging that her choices, even those as simple as rejecting a conversation at a bar, could now have unforeseen consequences, and that the quiet stranger she had encountered was a pivot point in a narrative larger than she had ever imagined. She sat at the small kitchen table, hands clasped, her mind weaving the threads of observation, speculation, and anticipation together, realizing that the day ahead would not be ordinary. That every action and glance might now be colored by the presence of someone whose identity was both extraordinary and hidden behind the calm, quiet exterior she had first observed. Emily Harper spent the morning pacing her apartment, the sunlight spilling across hardwood floors, illuminating her white skin and casting soft shadows that mirrored the swirl of thoughts in her mind as she replayed the previous night's encounter with Lucas Sterling, a white man in his mid-30s, whose calm demeanor at the bar had hidden a presence now magnified by the news coverage she could not escape. She moved toward the large bay windows, coffee in hand, watching the city stir beneath her, noticing the subtle movements of pedestrians, taxis, and cyclists as if the rhythm of Manhattan itself had shifted, infused with the quiet knowledge that someone extraordinary was out there, influencing events she barely understood. Her phone buzzed intermittently, each notification another echo of the citywide attention focused on Lucas, and she paused with a frown, considering how little she truly knew about a man whose face now filled television screens and social media feeds, whose presence had transformed from anonymity to prominence in the span of hours. She sat at her small dining table, notebook open, pen hovering over paper as she attempted to catalog the details she remembered, the neutral tone of his voice, the measured calm in his posture, the subtle intensity in his eyes, and to reconcile them with the sudden explosion of his identity across every channel she could access. Outside, the light changed as clouds passed over the sun, a soft breeze shifting curtains and carrying the distant hum of traffic, reminding her of the ordinary life that continued despite the extraordinary revelation she was facing. Emily's thoughts wandered to the bar, to the polite refusal that had seemed trivial in the moment, and she realized that this simple act had inadvertently connected her to someone whose world operated on a scale she had not considered, a scale defined by influence, observation, and the power to shape events quietly but decisively. The juxtaposition of her ordinary morning and the extraordinary presence of Lucas created an undercurrent of tension, subtle yet persistent, as she reflected on the weight of first impressions, the fragility of understanding, and the sudden expansion of her awareness to include someone whose life intersected with hers in ways that were deliberate, controlled, and entirely hidden until now. Each sip of coffee brought clarity mixed with anticipation, and as she glanced at the blinking notifications and muted television, she understood that the world had already begun to change around this man, and that her own choices, however small, had positioned her within that unfolding narrative, a narrative she would need to navigate carefully, balancing curiosity, caution, and the undeniable pull of intrigue that Lucas Sterling now represented. The afternoon light in Manhattan had begun to soften into a golden haze as Emily Harper stepped out of her apartment building, her white skin faintly illuminated by the warm glow of the sun reflecting off glass towers and polished steel surfaces, while her thoughts remained firmly anchored to the unfolding mystery surrounding Lucas Sterling, the man whose face now dominated every news channel across the city. She walked at a steady pace along the sidewalk, adjusting the strap of her bag, her expression composed yet reflective, as she noticed how the world around her continued its ordinary rhythm, pedestrians moving with urgency, taxis honking in the distance, and street vendors calling out their usual offers, while her inner awareness carried a new layer of tension that had not existed before. Every screen she passed in storefront windows or cafe displays seemed to echo the same image: Lucas Sterling, a white man in his mid-30s, now identified as a central figure in a developing national story, though the details remained deliberately vague and controlled by the media. Emily paused briefly at a crosswalk, her gaze drifting toward a large digital billboard where his face appeared again, sharper and more authoritative than she remembered from the bar, and she felt a subtle tightening in her chest as she tried to reconcile the quiet stranger she had dismissed with the public figure now revealed to the world. Across the city, Lucas remained unseen in person but unmistakably present in influence, his movements and decisions shaping the narrative that surrounded his identity, while Emily unknowingly stood at the intersection of two realities: the ordinary life she had always known and the extraordinary one now unfolding around him. She continued walking, entering a quieter street lined with small cafés and boutique storefronts, her steps slowing slightly as she reflected on the moment she had chosen to reject his conversation, an act that now felt heavier with meaning, as if it had opened a door she had not intended to unlock. Her phone vibrated again, and she glanced down to see a message from a colleague mentioning speculation about Lucas Sterling's background, the tone cautious and filled with curiosity, further deepening her sense that she was witnessing only fragments of a much larger story. Emily entered a cafe near the corner, choosing a seat by the window where she could observe the street outside, and she ordered coffee without fully registering the interaction, her attention divided between the present moment and the mental reconstruction of everything she now associated with Lucas. As she sat there, she noticed how easily her mind began to search for patterns, how his calm demeanor at the bar no longer seemed ordinary but instead deliberate, how his silence felt less like indifference and more like control, and how every detail she had initially overlooked now seemed significant in hindsight. The cafe's ambient noise surrounded her, cups clinking and soft conversations blending into a steady background rhythm, but her internal focus remained sharp, as though she were assembling a puzzle without yet knowing its final shape. Outside the window, the city moved as it always did, indifferent to individual revelations, yet Emily felt as though she had crossed a threshold of awareness, one where ordinary encounters could no longer be separated from the possibility of hidden meaning, and where the quiet stranger she had once dismissed had become an anchor point in a much larger and still unfolding narrative that she was only beginning to understand. Evening settled over the streets of Manhattan, the city lights flickering on one by one as Emily Harper stepped carefully along the sidewalk, her white skin catching the glow from street lamps and passing cars, her mind still occupied with the image of Lucas Sterling, the quiet man from the bar whose face had dominated every news broadcast that morning. The streets seemed both familiar and altered, ordinary yet layered with the knowledge that someone extraordinary was moving unseen through the city, his presence now magnified by public recognition and media attention. Emily's pace was steady but thoughtful, each step echoing softly against the concrete as she observed the patterns of passers-by, the subtle interactions between pedestrians, the rhythm of taxis weaving through intersections, and the faint hum of distant traffic, all forming a backdrop to the tension building quietly within her. Her bag rested lightly on her shoulder, and she adjusted it as she passed a newsstand, the digital screens replaying images of Lucas Sterling over and over, each clip reinforcing the gravity of the revelation she was processing. She paused briefly to sip her coffee from a to-go cup, feeling the warmth spread through her hands, and she allowed herself a moment to reflect on the contrast between the ordinary life she had led up until now and the extraordinary awareness she had acquired in less than 24 hours. Every detail of her encounter at the bar replayed vividly, the polite refusal, his composed acceptance, the quiet intensity in his eyes, and she considered the implications of knowing, even indirectly, someone whose life intersected with hers in such a dramatic and public way. Across the city, Lucas Sterling remained a figure of composed authority, his movements deliberate, his posture controlled, and even in moments of public exposure, he carried an air of calm that seemed to influence the attention around him without requiring direct action. Emily felt a growing sense of curiosity tempered by caution, her thoughts weaving through questions about his identity, the scope of his influence, and the reasons why she had encountered him at that precise moment in the bar. She walked on, entering a quieter street lined with small cafés and boutique shops, each window reflecting the golden city lights and her own contemplative expression, and she considered how ordinary moments could suddenly carry extraordinary weight when intersected by people whose lives operated on a level she was only beginning to grasp. Her footsteps slowed as she approached her destination, the gentle hum of the city night blending with the soft clinking of café dishes and distant conversations, and she realized that her life had subtly shifted, her awareness expanded, and her understanding of human connection deepened in ways she had not anticipated, all stemming from the brief, polite exchange she had dismissed so casually only hours before, a reminder that sometimes the smallest decisions create ripples far larger than imagined, and that attention, even unspoken, could change the ordinary into something extraordinary. The night in Manhattan had deepened into a quiet, reflective calm as Emily Harper stood near the window of her apartment, her white skin softly illuminated by the warm glow of a nearby street lamp filtering through the glass, while her thoughts remained firmly anchored to the unfolding story surrounding Lucas Sterling, the quiet stranger whose presence had shifted from anonymity to national attention in less than a day. The city outside moved in its usual rhythm, headlights tracing lines across the wet pavement, distant sirens fading into the background, and pedestrians continuing their routines unaware of the subtle tension that now shaped Emily's inner world. She held a warm cup of coffee in both hands, her posture relaxed yet attentive, as she replayed every detail she could remember from their brief encounter at the bar, searching for meaning in the calmness of his voice, the steadiness of his gaze, and the unusual way he had accepted her rejection without reaction or resistance. Across the city, Lucas Sterling remained a figure of quiet control, a white man in his mid-30s whose public identity now carried weight far beyond the ordinary, his movements and decisions carefully managed within a structure that Emily could only begin to imagine, yet his earlier presence at the bar now felt like a deliberate moment placed within her life, as if it had been part of a larger sequence she had not yet understood. Emily moved away from the window and sat at her kitchen table, opening her laptop as news updates continued to refresh across multiple channels, each headline reinforcing the idea that Lucas was not merely a man but a focal point of unfolding events that had captured the attention of an entire city. She scrolled slowly, absorbing fragments of information, while her mind worked to connect the quiet stranger she had dismissed with the figure now presented in public view, and each attempt only deepened her awareness that there was a significant gap between perception and reality. The room around her was silent except for the faint hum of electronics and the distant sounds of traffic filtering through the closed windows, yet her internal focus remained intense, as though she were assembling a puzzle without having all its pieces. She thought again about the bar, about the brief exchange that had felt insignificant at the time but now carried an unexpected weight, and she considered how easily people could overlook the presence of someone whose influence or importance was not immediately visible. Lucas, in contrast, remained composed within the structure of his world, his public emergence handled with precision and restraint, reinforcing the sense that his identity operated on layers Emily had not yet accessed. As she closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, she felt a subtle shift in understanding, a recognition that her experience was no longer isolated or random but connected to something larger and still unfolding. The city outside continued without pause, indifferent to individual revelations, yet for Emily the boundaries of her awareness had expanded, and the quiet stranger from the bar was no longer a passing memory but a persistent question that lingered at the edge of her thoughts, shaping her perception of every ordinary moment that followed. The evening settled over Manhattan with a soft golden hue, the city's skyscrapers reflecting the fading light as Emily Harper stepped onto the quiet streets, her white skin catching the last rays of sun, and her thoughts once again returning to Lucas Sterling, the white man whose presence had shifted overnight from a quiet stranger to a figure commanding public attention across every news channel. She moved with a steady, deliberate pace, adjusting the strap of her bag, her expression composed yet laced with curiosity and cautious anticipation, noticing how the ordinary rhythm of the city now seemed layered with the knowledge of someone extraordinary influencing events unseen. Her footsteps echoed faintly against the pavement, mixing with the distant hum of traffic and muffled conversations, each sound grounding her in a city that felt both familiar and subtly altered by the presence of Lucas's amplified identity. She paused briefly near a small park, watching the reflection of streetlights in puddles, the gentle sway of leaves, and the movement of passerby who were unaware of the narrative unfolding around them, and she considered how a single moment, the polite rejection at a bar, had unexpectedly intersected with the larger, complex story that Lucas now represented. Across the city, Lucas remained composed, a figure of calm authority in a world that seemed both ordinary and extraordinary from Emily's perspective, and though he was not physically present nearby, the awareness of his influence created a subtle tether between their lives, one that filled the spaces between moments and interactions with anticipation and layered meaning. Emily continued along the sidewalk, entering a quiet street lined with small cafés and boutique shops, each window reflecting her contemplative face and the city lights, her mind piecing together details from their previous encounter while considering the media coverage that had rendered him both public and enigmatic simultaneously. She found herself analyzing small clues, how his calm acceptance of rejection revealed confidence and subtle control, how his expression seemed to hold more than he revealed, and how the city itself became a backdrop for a narrative she was only beginning to comprehend. As she moved toward her apartment, she noticed how each ordinary interaction, the exchange of a polite nod with a passerby, the distant sound of a taxi horn, the rustling of leaves in the wind, was imbued with an added weight, a reminder that perception and awareness could transform ordinary experiences into moments of significant consequence. Her heart carried a mix of curiosity, cautious fascination, and a nascent sense of connection, a recognition that Lucas's quiet presence had already begun to influence the rhythm of her thoughts, her awareness, and the way she interpreted the ordinary and extraordinary alike. She reached the familiar threshold of her building, her steps deliberate, and paused for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing in the evening air, the ambient city sounds merging with the echo of possibilities, understanding that the story she had entered at the bar, simple and unremarkable at first glance, had grown into a complex and unfolding narrative where observation, choice, and the hidden layers of human identity were shaping the trajectory of both her life and the life of the man she had once dismissed as a quiet stranger. The city had shifted into night, the lights of Manhattan casting long reflections on wet streets as Emily Harper moved with careful awareness, her white skin softly illuminated by neon signs and street lamps, carrying a subtle tension in her posture that mirrored the swirling thoughts in her mind about Lucas Sterling, the white man whose presence had transformed overnight from quiet stranger to a figure of public prominence. She walked through the quieter avenues, observing the interplay of shadows and light, the faint movement of pedestrians, and the gentle hum of distant traffic, all creating a cinematic backdrop to the emotional weight she carried as she considered the contrast between the man she had dismissed in a bar and the authority and mystery now attached to his name in news headlines. Her hands rested lightly on the strap of her bag, her eyes flicking to reflections in shop windows, each glance reinforcing the awareness that her ordinary life had intersected with someone whose existence now influenced the perceptions and attentions of an entire city. Emily paused near a small plaza, inhaling the cool night air, and noted the way Lucas's image continued to populate the digital and televised landscape, a persistent reminder of how perception and identity can shift in unexpected ways, and how a simple interaction can ripple outward into consequences far beyond initial understanding. The tension in her chest was tempered by a cautious curiosity as she thought back to his calm acceptance of her rejection, the neutrality of his expression, and the quiet composure that had hinted at depth and control even in casual encounters, a stark contrast to the public figure revealed in media coverage. Moving along, she observed street vendors packing up for the night, the occasional taxi gliding past, and the muted chatter of late-night pedestrians, all ordinary elements imbued with a sense of altered reality because of the presence of Lucas's unfolding story. She found herself reflecting on the subtle cues she had missed, the steadiness of his eyes, the deliberate calm in his movements, and the restrained confidence that had never demanded attention yet suggested influence. Each step she took reinforced her awareness that she was now part of a narrative larger than herself, where ordinary streets and familiar places were stages for events shaped by unseen forces and quiet power. She paused at the corner of a dimly lit street, the neon glow painting her features and casting elongated shadows behind her, feeling the full weight of anticipation and the psychological pull of a man whose quiet exterior had concealed an extraordinary reality. In that moment, the ordinary world and the extraordinary revelation intersected, and Emily understood that the night, the city, and her own perception had changed, leaving her poised at the edge of discovery, curiosity, and the slow unfolding of a story she had only begun to witness, where each movement, glance, and reflection carried the subtle yet powerful influence of someone who had entered her life quietly but whose presence would resonate for days to come. The night in Manhattan had grown quieter, the streets reflecting scattered light from tall buildings as Emily Harper walked alone along the sidewalk, her white skin softly illuminated by the glow of passing street lamps, her expression calm but deeply thoughtful as she carried the lingering weight of everything she had learned about Lucas Sterling, the white man whose quiet presence at a bar had transformed into a name now circulating across every news channel in the city. Each step she took felt measured, as if the rhythm of the city had become slightly more deliberate, shaped by her growing awareness that ordinary moments could conceal extraordinary truths. She adjusted her coat against the cool night air and slowed near a crosswalk, watching reflections of headlights stretch across the wet pavement, her mind replaying fragments of memory, the stillness of Lucas's expression, the controlled calm in his voice, and the absence of reaction when she had dismissed him without hesitation. Now, those fragments carried new meaning, each detail subtly reframed by the knowledge that he was not an ordinary stranger but a figure whose identity and influence extended far beyond what she had initially perceived. Across the city, Lucas Sterling, a white man in his mid-30s, remained composed within the structure of his world, his public emergence carefully managed and his presence in the media landscape both controlled and deliberate, reinforcing the sense that his life operated on a level layered with intention and awareness that Emily was only beginning to understand. She continued walking, entering a quieter street where the sounds of the city softened into distant echoes, and she felt a subtle shift within herself, a blend of curiosity and cautious reflection as she considered how her rejection of a simple conversation had unknowingly intersected with someone whose life now occupied public attention and private complexity simultaneously. The streetlights cast long shadows across her path, and she found herself noticing small details, the flicker of a neon sign in a corner store, the slow movement of a distant taxi, the faint rustle of wind through trees lining the sidewalk, all of which seemed to carry a heightened sense of awareness, as though her perception had expanded alongside her understanding of Lucas. She paused briefly outside a glass storefront, catching her reflection layered over images of the city behind her. And for a moment she considered how easily lives could intersect without warning, how a brief exchange at a bar could evolve into a thread connecting two individuals across an unfolding narrative neither had fully anticipated. Emily exhaled slowly, her thoughts no longer focused on confusion alone but on a growing recognition that her life had subtly shifted into alignment with something larger, something still forming and still uncertain, yet undeniably present in her awareness. As she resumed walking toward her apartment, the city continued its steady rhythm around her, but within her own perspective, each sound, light, and movement now carried the echo of a story that had only just begun, where ordinary decisions had created unexpected intersections and where the quiet stranger she once dismissed had become an enduring presence within her thoughts, shaping her understanding of attention, consequence, and the unseen connections that bind people together in ways that only revealed themselves over time.